What is this? It's interesting how Hasan uses the word resistance. I absolutely agree with what Israel has done as genocide and terrorism, but isn't calling what I perceive as Hamas something relatively positive as resistance? Aren't they a terrorist just like Israel government and Zionists? No, they are a part of a national resistance front, because October 7 is not the pivotal turning point of this, of the plight of the Palestinians. They are objectively a national resistance front. They are a part of the national resistance front, a resistance to the occupation. Not just a resistance to Israeli genocide, but a resistance to the Israeli occupation and sovereignty over the indigenous Palestinian population. They are quite literally resistance. The reason why people don't use that terminology, and this is where, we get into words mean something, and the reason why they say, the reason why a lot of people say, no, you mustn't call them that, you have to call them terrorists, is because terrorism is a loaded term. It's a vague term, and it is a term designed to deny the people any sort of due process so they can be destroyed, they can be killed. And in Israel's case, they can even end up collateralizing all of the other civilians that are around what Israel has declared and what the American government continues to say are terrorists. Okay? I'm sure you've heard the term one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, but that is kind of the dynamic. It's reductive to say it like that, but it is kind of the dynamic. And I think you can see this dynamic actually play itself out right now in Latin America. Okay? America is currently using that vague definition of terrorism that they've slapped on to every single person that is sailing on a boat off of their own coastlines to illegally and extrajudicially murder random people on boats and then say they're narco-terrorists. That is perhaps one of the greatest examples of how silly this entire process is. They call them narco-terrorists. And when you call someone a terrorist, when the American government or the Israeli government or one of the allied nations calls a group of people terrorists, more often than not, they're not white, by the way, then they can get away with doing whatever the fuck they want. It seems like the U.S., in the U.S. anyway, resistance carries a positive connotation and evokes ideas of fighting against oppression, while terrorism carries a connotation of nonsensical and unlimited violence. Maybe militant is a neutral version, but I don't know if it has any connotation. Yes, but it is perfectly valid to both call Hezbollah and Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and even Palestinian Islamic Jihad, regardless of their own personal ideologies, regardless of how they think Palestinian society should be run, to be the militant front for national resistance. For Hezbollah, it is a Shia paramilitary group that was designed specifically to fight back against Israeli incursion inside of Lebanese borders and to also protect the Shia population against sectarian violence that was taking place, oftentimes directed by Western leadership and specifically by Israel. As far as Hamas goes, as far as all of these groups go, if you look at the actual history of the term terrorist ever, the term terrorist being utilized, the first time that it was ever found as a legal definition was actually in response to, I believe, the PLO. So ironically enough, we started calling Palestinian resistance groups terrorists all the way back decades prior to the term becoming much more broadly accepted in the aftermath of the war on terror after 9/11. No, it's not back in the 90s. It's even before then. Actually, the DFLP hasn't been designated a terror org for multiple decades. Yes, because they've been successfully dismantled. That's the reason. They are incredibly marginal. John Brown was both a militant and a terrorist in the context of the state at the time, but was still just, despite the label. The words don't really matter. News is always propaganda, for example, despite the negative associations with the word. Yes, exactly. That's a lie, by the way. The U.S. government just went after a charity for being a front for material support for PFLP and terrorism. Yes, PFLP and DFLP are different. PFLP has a little bit more motion than DFLP, and they just don't really exist at all. At least PFLP has like maybe 100 people, but the Democratic Front is virtually non-existent as far as I understand. Even though the limited amount of the limited amount of people that are a part of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which, by the way, PFLP and DFLP are both different Marxist tendencies. They're socialist formations. They used to have a lot more. They used to have a lot more membership. They used to have a lot more. Yeah, DFLP split from PFLP back in the day. But regardless, one of them is I think Maoist. I think DFLP might be Maoist. It doesn't really matter. They are super, super marginal. Okay, they are very marginal in the grand scheme of things. Like the resistance front is predominantly led by Hamas. Hamas has taken over the I guess the PLO as like the organizing factor as a part of the militant resistance front. And one of the successes that they have seen is that they've been able to combine the entirety of the resistance front. So it's mostly Hamas that has the largest number of militants, largest number of armed combatants, and followed closely by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas, however, unlike the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also has a civil governance component in Gaza, whereas the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not a real party anymore. Like they have no interest in, at least in the last like couple of decades, they have not necessarily had any sort of investment in operating as a part of the political infrastructure of Palestinians. More so they are more so a militancy. They don't do a lot of politics. They just have a brigade. What's interesting, at least in my experience, and maybe I'm a little bit wrong about this, but like PFLP, back when in their heyday, was actually quickly eradicated by Israel because they saw PFLP as a real threat, because they could do an international Marxist call to arms and they could get support from other existing international Marxist organizations. And that was a major problem for the Mossad. That was a major issue for the Mossad. So as opposed to how much motion that they previously had, the amount of motion they have now is fairly limited, because they were a part of an international Marxist movement, which is precisely the reason why like you had the Japanese Red Army faction that would go to Lebanon and train with the PFLP, and then would go and like hijack planes and stuff back in the day. And many of them were Christian too. Many of them were Christian Palestinians, and Israel assassinated all of them, including their leadership, alongside their family members in places like Lebanon, like Hasan, who had never actually held a weapon, as far as I understand. He was specifically a writer, and yet Israel killed them all the same. This does not mean that there weren't militants within the PFLP. Of course, there were, but Israel killed the militants and the non-militants all the same. And of course, even then, their militancy was certainly valid. They were resisting against an oppressive settler colonial apparatus that was backed by the entirety of the Western world at the time. It's crazy the leftists, even outside the imperial core, still have infighting and splitting. How is that always so difficult? What are the major disagreements that these groups have that split them? Are they actually being sabotaged by liberals? No. As much as I would like to say it's the fucking liberals or it's the reactionaries that infiltrate these movements, and there are some instances where they do that, this has been an endless problem on the left. If you ever look to the history of successful socialist revolutions and unsuccessful revolutionary movements, reformist, revisionist movements, it just always is. It always has existed. There is a reason why every single important Marxist, socialist thinker, even during a successful revolution, has spent endless amounts of time constantly criticizing other delineations and other tendencies amongst the left. There's never been a moment where successful law, yes, I would say the USSR was the aftermath of a successful revolution. If you can design a state, then your revolution was successful. You might not agree with like how the state is managed after that. Okay. I think a lot of the infighting also stems from how overwhelming the forces of capital R, it makes it virtually impossible to design any sort of discipline in any sort of movement, especially because a lot of people have very different versions of what it means to be authoritarian and what it means to be a democratically organized movement. And those differences become fairly consequential in the grand scheme of things. And no one turns around and goes, okay, we've actually achieved this success. We've actually destroyed Tsarist Russia. Now it's time for us to unify. It never works that way. It happens at every point. The American left, which is virtually non-existent, okay, is a great example of this. Even when we got no class consciousness as a country, even when we have no real robust left movement in the country, people are still fucking constantly eating each other alive, talking about how different it is. It's bullshit.